Dioxus is the Rust framework for building full-stack web, desktop, and mobile apps. It has 30,000 GitHub stars, 350 contributors, reached the top of GitHub trending, received $500,000 in funding from Y Combinator, and is trusted by top companies like Airbus and the European Space Agency. So I decided to build a website with Dioxus to get to know it better. As someone who's only dabbled with Rust before, I can definitively say that I hate it now more than ever. Despite this, I think Dioxus has some innovative ideas. The founder is super passionate about making app development easier and gives me hardcore startup founder vibes. But as a jaded startup founder myself, I know that innovation isn't always sufficient for success. In my opinion, a red flag for any project is trying to boil the ocean, tackling several loosely related problems at once, becoming a jack of all trades and master of none. You can't parlay failure in one area into success in another. An even bigger red flag is when developer testimonials are missing, outdated, and poorly represented. Facing an uphill battle in a competitive market, Dioxus seems to exhibit both of these red flags, which I believe gives a poor impression of the framework's health to new developers. In this video, I'm going to take you through my journey with Dioxus, and give my advice to the founder for how to salvage his silently dying framework. For my first project, I decided to make a better version of the Dioxus website, since it's pretty bare bones, and the developer's roadmap includes it as an item for the next release. Installing Dioxus was pretty straightforward using the guide in the documentation. I created a project with all the default settings. The only exception was for enabling Tailwind CSS, since this made styling the page way easier. Dioxus is heavily modeled after React, using a syntax known as RSX, managing components in a virtual DOM, and using hooks to manage component lifecycles. After waiting 20 seconds for the app to build, I opened it in the browser, happy to see that there were no errors. I added Tailwind class names in the RSX syntax. However, it didn't work out of the box. According to the README, I had to run this npx command to allow for hot reloading with Tailwind. This kind of feels like it defeats the purpose of using Rust, since I still need to use JavaScript tooling to make it work correctly. Also, there were two files named tailwind.css, which confused me when debugging the issue. To improve the developer experience with Tailwind, I included this snippet in the VS Code settings, which enabled autocomplete and linting for the Tailwind class names. With Tailwind working, I started thinking about how the Dioxus website could be improved. I think it would be very helpful to see the user showcase on the homepage, since it would demonstrate how Dioxus helps solve real-world problems. Using the Flutter showcase as a starting point, I took a screenshot, gave it to Claude Code, and asked it to replicate it with Dioxus. I was extremely surprised by the result. I didn't think the AI would understand the Dioxus RSX code, but I was proven wrong. There are 19 projects listed on the Dioxus showcase. I felt it would be better to filter out the unmaintained projects and dedicate more space to the active ones. After I removed projects with no commits in the last 6 months, there were only 6 left. I think it'll be easier to show you the final result first, then explain the changes I made. Showing logos for every project makes the showcase more visually appealing, and builds brand recognition for Dioxus users. Coloring in the cards makes them easier to distinguish from the background. Separating the showcase of user projects from the community of Dioxus-related tooling avoids the need to add a search bar to the showcase to find anything, like they're planning to do with the next release of the website. Finally, including launch dates for each project shows the breadth of time over which Dioxus has been used, which leans into the maturity of the Dioxus project and its developers. If you want to play around with this showcase demo, you can find the link to the website and the source code in the description. Before deploying the website on Vercel, I had to fix this annoying flash of unstyled content that kept happening when the website loaded. It turns out the JavaScript code dynamically inserts the style sheet links, so the page renders before the style sheets are ready. To fix this, I manually went into the build outputs and linked the style sheets myself, since the style sheet names are effectively random for each build. After deploying to Vercel, I ran Lighthouse on the website, which gave a performance score of 78. That's kind of low given that it's a simple one-page website without any fancy features. I think the main cause of the bad score is the 446 kilobyte WebAssembly file that blocks rendering until it's loaded. The WebAssembly contains the compiled Rust code that manages the virtual DOM. Out of curiosity, I ran Lighthouse on dioxuslabs.com, and I got a 38 on the performance score, loading a WebAssembly file over 2.2 megabytes. You could argue that Dioxus is intended for web apps and not web sites, but that definitely limits the usefulness of Dioxus as a general-purpose front-end framework. Disclaimer: Do not harass any company or individual mentioned in the following section. At this point, I was getting curious about why a company like Airbus would be using this particular framework, especially back in 2023, when Dioxus presumably had even less functionality and more bugs. And given that only 6 out of the 19 projects in the showcase are still active, I had a feeling that something was off. Let's look at the Y Combinator announcement first. Airbus and the European Space Agency are building a satellite collision avoidance system. The link takes us to a website called Skytrace, which, based on the business address and its terms of service, is created by a separate company called Skytrace Global Limited. It looks like it might be a contractor who supplies Airbus with the software. The Heroes section says that Skytrace helps to reduce the risk of collision and extends the life of your satellites. Wait, my satellites? Why is there a public sign-up button here? In any case, the AI-narrated demo video mentions that
the workflow is based on systems used at Airbus and the European Space Agency.
That seems to imply that Airbus actually uses a different workflow with different software. Or maybe it's just worded weirdly. Anyway, scrolling down to the footer of the website, we can follow the link to the documentation, which is not found. We can also follow the links to the FAQ, mission, and careers, but they all lead to the blog. The copyright is from 2021 to 2023, which makes the software look like it's been discontinued. Since the code is open source, for some reason, we can look at the commit history to see if it's still maintained. The first commit was in March of 2023, and the last commit was in April of 2023, so it looks like this software has been abandoned. Also notice how there is only one contributor to the project, which seems strange for software used by Airbus. I decided to purchase a couple of satellites to see if the collision detection system works correctly, so I signed up for an account. The latest data shown in the user interface is from April 2023, which is consistent with what we've seen so far. On the dashboard page, it shows me the total number of users for the app. I don't think that's in line with best security practices, but maybe there's some community features planned for the software. When your headline or customer leads to a scuffed website, AI voiceover, broken links, and blockchain as a feature, my first impression is not positive, to say the least. And that's really the whole story of the Y Combinator announcement post. Huawei is mentioned at the top of the post, but based on other materials I found online, Huawei appears to be an investor in, and not a user of, the Dioxus framework. A product called Satellite.im is linked, but their GitHub repo doesn't even use Rust at all. It turns out the Dioxus version is deprecated. They have another repo using Dioxus, labeled as Alpha Software, but it hasn't been touched in over a year. Actually, the last commit on any repository was 4 months ago. I can't tell if the company is still operating, but according to LinkedIn, the founder no longer works at the company. Finally, we have the beautiful Mastodon client that a community member built, which leads to a 404 page. It's only been 2 years since Dioxus was accepted into Y Combinator, yet the announcement page more closely resembles a graveyard than a showcase. The Dioxus Labs website, which the maintainers are in control of, lists some of the same companies, and has the same problems, conflating investors with users, and not providing any links to blog posts, or even quotes from the companies listed. I want to play you a clip from the GoSim conference, where the Dioxus founder presented to an audience in Beijing. This one part really stood out to me.
We also benefit from this AI boom. The AI models out there really know HTML and CSS. They can pump out Dioxus components, no problem.
Yes, AI is able to vibe code very effectively with Dioxus because it's using RSX and Tailwind. But you can do the same thing using Claude Code from a completely empty directory on your computer. I took a screenshot of a website and said replicate this for me. It made some questionable technical decisions, but it got the job done. Everyone feels like a 10x developer because they have access to AI, but they fail to realize that everyone else has access to the exact same AI. So we're in a situation where 10x as many people are trying to become software engineers, even though there's 10x fewer jobs needed. People feel the most powerful in their weakest position. For Dioxus to be a viable competitor to React for web development, it would need to replicate React DevTools for inspecting the virtual DOM, Redux DevTools for inspecting the application state, debugger functionality that JavaScript has and Rust doesn't, and even quality of life things like automatic Tailwind class name sorting. And after all this, Dioxus will only have feature parity with React, but with significantly worse page load performance. The market for Dioxus isn't web, desktop, or mobile apps. The market is for developers who target all of these platforms with one codebase. Although it may seem desirable to use the same code for every platform, this usually isn't the case. Let's take Google Maps as an example. The mobile app probably represents 90% of the usage of the platform. If we wanted to add web functionality to the mobile app, we would need to modify hundreds of things, like removing the marker showing where you are on the map, removing the live navigation mode, completely changing the menu structure, adding Street View, and so much more. Why massively complicate the code for the mobile app just to serve the 10% of people using the web app? It's better to keep the codebases separate in this case. I haven't talked about the full stack aspect of Dioxus yet. Dioxus has server functions, similar to how Next.js works for React. The monetization plan for Dioxus is to offer cloud services similar to Vercel. So for the future success of Dioxus as a business, it must also attract developers who desire both front-end and back-end functionality. Viewed through this lens, the improved showcase still reflects poorly on Dioxus's position in the market. Hemi and Link Echo haven't had any commits in the past 3 months, so it's questionable to call them active projects. The Felonium project is made by one of the employees of Dioxus Labs, and Bionic GPT is made by the same guy who created the Airbus satellite collision avoidance system. Worst of all, none of these projects use Dioxus server functions, so if Dioxus Labs releases their Dioxus deploy product, it doesn't look like there's any users from the showcase who could take advantage of it. I want to give some advice to the founder of Dioxus from the book The Lean Startup by Eric Ries. The audacity of zero. The irony is that it is often easier to raise money or acquire other resources when you have zero revenue, zero customers, and zero traction than when you have a small amount. Zero invites imagination, but small numbers invite questions about whether large numbers will ever materialize. Everyone knows, or thinks he or she knows, stories of products that achieved breakthrough success overnight. As long as nothing has been released and no data has been collected, it is still possible to imagine overnight success in the future. Small numbers pour cold water on that hope. It's easy to say that business is booming because you reached the top of GitHub trending, but don't be fooled by the audacity of zero. Instead of collecting GitHub repositories like their gym badges, focus on getting a single dollar of revenue from a customer who isn't an investor. Or even focus on getting any Dioxus user their first dollar from a customer. I suspect you will find it harder than you think. I want to end with my thoughts about the Rust ecosystem as a whole. If you're a Rust maximalist who embraces the idea that Rust is on the moon and powers 40% of the internet, just remember that having 30,000 GitHub stars isn't necessarily the flex that you think it is. Most Rust projects I see are backward-facing, wondering how the world could have been a better place if only all the software were written with Rust. But you have to skate to where the puck is going. You might have thought that Flutter or React Native cross-platform was terrible when you went full-time in 2023, but you need to take into account the time it takes to develop a competitor. For example, Flutter Web is significantly better in 2025 than it was in 2023, now that they've implemented hot reload for the web. JetBrains' Compose Multiplatform is going to be better in 2026 once the web version reaches feature parity with other platforms. Is Dioxus going to be the best choice for mobile development in 2026? With every second, the window of opportunity for Dioxus to become a viable competitor is shrinking. I'm not saying that every open source project needs to dominate the market or should aim to monetize their users, but with $500,000 in funding, the bar for success is very high. Be sure to check out the links in the description, and, as always, thanks for watching.